My name is Jackson Laframboise, and I'm finally here to answer the age-old question. What's better, Apple or Android? It'd be too controversial if I did that, so what's better, Apple or Android's voice recording software? Just to preface, I know this seems like a lazy idea. We're supposed to be doing a voice memo to explain our opinions, and I decided to do it on the Voice Memo app. However, I have my reasons. I'm recording this entire thing through a professional audio engineering software, and I figured that this would give me a little bit less bias. You see, there's a lot of extra functionality in this software that I'm using to record this that is not on the Voice Memo apps. However, I'm still using this as though it is a Voice Memo application, and this will allow me to actually see which functions on the applications are necessary and which ones are simply cluttering the UI. As well as this, looking at the Android and iOS applications, it's quite clear that they're drawing some of their inspiration from these professional-grade applications. I figured that by going back and forth between a professional recording software and a note-taking app, it would be a lot easier to see which one simplified the functionality the best without losing any of the features. Now this ties me right into how I'm going to be comparing these two softwares. Aside from using my professional software to contrast them, I'm also going to be having a few benchmarks to compare them with. The first one being accessibility. Phone applications are for everybody. They shouldn't be a challenge to get into. You should just hit a button and record your audio, and that's it. What they lack in features, they make up for in usability, and I feel like accessibility within the realm of the app world is one of the most important categories to nail. However, accessibility would be nothing without productivity. You see, doing nothing is technically the easiest thing, so if you had an app that did nothing, it would be the most accessible app out there. However, it also needs to have usefulness, and that's why this category is so important. It's also why it's so hard for companies to nail. You see, somebody's definition of usefulness and somebody's definition of easy to use is different. It's a subjective trait. That's why you see some people out there praising Android for its modular capabilities and high functionality, while also trashing iPhones for being overly simplified, and vice versa. It's going to be less about comparing the two softwares objectively and more about seeing how they pay homage to their OS. What's a little less subjective, however, is bugs. Blatant disregard from the OS developers. See, I'm going to be scoring the two applications using dumb points. Blatant dumb things that occurred for no reason. Let's say a keyboard's too big and it covers the functionality of a menu, something along those lines. Things that might be hardware driven or something that just wasn't fixed in post. I'm not expecting to see a ton of these, but if I do, they're going to be weighted heavily because, come on, these companies are massive and they have time to fix these things. Lastly, I'm going to be throwing objectivity and technicality out the window. I'm simply going to use these two applications on the two devices for a week, and after that I'm going to come back with a no-brainer conclusion on which one I prefer to use. I'm not going to be analyzing it, I'm not going to be overthinking it, I'm simply just going to use them and come back and try to figure out a reason why I enjoyed one over the other. It's going to be very nuanced, and I figured that my actual response will probably be a little bit more abstract than the prior categories, but I figured by doing those ones first and then comparing and contrasting my answers for this category, I'll more easily be able to fill in the gaps that I may have missed in my previous statements. Those gaps being time, emotion, and other variables that I can't foresee until I actually do the field test. Alright, now that that's finally out of the way, let's begin. Accessibility. Alright, so right out of the gate, Android is starting pretty strong here. It's very minimal and there's only about 5 buttons that you can actually press on the home page. That being said, some of them are sort of vague and I'll get into that in a second. So the first one on the far left is recordings. That's simply just a library where you can store all of your recordings. The next one is stop, which that's how you stop your recordings. The middle one is the universal symbol for recordings, the red circle. Good job, Android. Lastly, there's quick tag and photo tag. Now on a surface level, it seems pretty straightforward. They're used to tag your audio recording. But what does that mean? Does it tag a segment of it? What's the difference between that and a title? Well, I'll get more into that in the productivity segment, but as I'm looking at it from an accessibility standpoint at the moment, it's not initially clear what these buttons do, and because of that, I'm taking some points off. Sorry, Android. Now on to iOS. Surprisingly, they managed to make it even more simple than Android. It's simply just a record button and a segmented section of files to look through your old recordings. Now that's simple. But accessibility isn't simply about simplicity. It's about how simple it is to use, not how simple it looks. And Apple takes this yet again. It can't get any easier than Apple. It's as easy as it looks. You press the red button, it records, and then it saves directly in front of you, all on the same page. Android has a little bit of a problem in terms of their UI design. The main homepage has a gigantic circular button-looking thing at the top left, which in theory can do something. It's unclear what it would do, and when you try to tap it, you realize it doesn't do anything. It's simply there to keep track of time when you're recording, but it doesn't go away when you're not recording, so it looks like another way to record audio, when in reality, it's just misleading. And part of me gets it. I mean, it looks nice, and it really reminds the customer that they're actually using the recording app. If it weren't for the record sentence at the top, the button that looks like a record button, and every other indicator that this is indeed an audio tracking software, it wouldn't be so damn redundant, but sadly it is. It would have been easily fixable too. They could simply just put a 0 timestamp at the bottom of the indicator to show that yes, this is indeed an HUD and not a button, but they make it so vague that it's almost ironic. They tried to make the application more clear to the customer, but instead they accidentally made it less clear, and it would have been better if they just added nothing. All of this nitpicking aside though, Android actually did a lot of things way better than iOS. For one, the pause function during recording is way easier to access. As I was saying earlier, iPhone only has the record button in the center of the screen, meanwhile Android has the stop button to the left. Well, why is the stop button to the left? On iOS, in order to access the pause function, you have to swipe up and then you get the HUD that displays some of the secondary functions like pause, skip, etc. Meanwhile on Android, when you press the record button, it doubles as a pause button, and that's because they had room to do that because the stop button was to the left. And one might initially critique the stop button being separate from the record button. It makes a lot of sense to have it embedded because that's how you stop recordings in actual professional software. But this isn't a professional software. It's a lot better to have it easier to cut up a take, catch your breath, etc., than to accidentally stop a video halfway through because you accidentally double-clicked or tapped the middle of the screen. And for this, I gotta give a lot of points back to Android. Although their UI is a little bit flawed in the ways that I stated earlier, it's only for about 20 seconds that this is really an issue, and after that you adapt to it. Stuff like this, having a separate stop button, having an embedded pause button within the record button, these may just be little things, but they're the little things that add up to make an overall great accessible experience for the Android recording app. And because of this, I actually prefer recording audio on Android over iPhone. However, audio input is only one of the categories within a voice recording application. There's also the file sorting, because what's the point of recording all this audio if you can't find it? And I just have to say they're almost the exact same. After looking at them, they're all sorted by date, they have a numerical title by default, which gets adjusted when you change it. Everything is kind of laid out in a way that's easily viewable. You can see the title, you can see how long the video is. At this point, it's been done so much that it's almost harder to mess this up than it is to get it right, so they kind of all get a draw in this category. But what happens once you click on a file? This is where things get a little bit interesting. As I said earlier, accessibility can be subjective in certain scenarios, and this is a good example of that. It's hard to say which out of the two audio editors is better because they're so biased based on their OS. To alter the file on iPhone, you hit the triple dot button at the bottom left-hand corner of the audio recording section. This gives you a bunch of options to copy, share, edit, duplicate, favorite, etc. the file. And because the triple dot drop-down menu is such a common theme amongst iOS devices, and nobody's buying an iOS device simply to only record audio, it's actually quite intuitive to do this. People who use the iPhone for every other purpose will go into this application and immediately know how to use it. The same cannot initially be said for Android. In fact, their OS works so much against them that it's hilarious. So at the bottom of every Android device, there's a triangle, which is the back button, a circle, which is the home button, and a square, which is the tab button. What else has a triangle, a circle, and a square? That's right, every audio recording software on the entire planet. They're universal. Triangle is play, circle is record, and square is stop. Even as an avid Android user, the subconscious programming that's been ingrained in my brain from using recording softwares made it so I exited out of the actual editor about 3 times before realizing I was hitting the back button and not the play button. Let's say you're not an avid Android user. Let's say you're using it as a secondary device. Maybe you have 2 phones and you're using one for business and one for leisure. That's okay. But let's say you need to take some business notes on your phone and need to do an audio recording, and you try to hit pause while you're recording to quickly catch your breath, and you accidentally hit the circle button, which sends you back to the home screen. No big deal, right? It stops recording. No, it doesn't. It continues recording in the background, and getting back in the application makes it seem as though you haven't started recording in the first place, so the only actual way to get out of a recording once you've left to the home screen is to go into the tabs menu and to swipe up. Ironically enough, the button that looks like a stop button is the only way to stop a recording if you accidentally try to pause it and go home. And I know I said with iOS that sometimes seemingly vague buttons, as long as they're a universal concept amongst an OS, is okay, because people will know how to use it. And I know that Android was going for that. However, the universality of recording audio and video is even more ingrained in humanity than using Android. And because of this, the overall experience and accessibility of this application is made difficult for people familiar with Android and people unfamiliar with Android. So the subjective nature of accessibility can now turn into an objective fail on behalf of Android, because everybody can agree that overlapping universal symbolism is really confusing. Speaking of overlapping and confusing, if you couldn't already tell, I somewhat segued into the productivity section of this analysis. The reason being is that productivity and accessibility go hand in hand. They're codependent. Something's only as useful as you can use it. So let's say you have a million different features and you have no idea how to use any of them. It's the exact same as having no features. This is also why I added the silly sounding category based around bug errors and oversights on the OS developers labeled dumb points. This is also why I weighed these dumb points quite heavily. It's because if you get a few too many of those, there are additional features that sometimes can take away from both the accessibility and productivity of an application, and by doing so, normally it makes the company look quite lazy because these oversights are generally quite easy for a consumer to pick up on. Test your stuff! All that being said, one of these applications is bound to have more features than the other one. I'm going to look through and count all the features, and then deduce whether or not those features actually lead to a more productive experience, or if they just further confuse me. And after testing, I realized that just counting the features is actually a pretty bad way of doing this. The real test is what features actually are added that make sense in the context of what the application is trying to do. And these two apps actually do very different things. They have a different definition in their mind of what an audio voice note-taking application is supposed to do. But what one makes the most sense? Android. Android makes the most sense. They see a recording application on a smart device as more of a note-taking application, and thus they make it a little bit better at reminding a person of what the recording's there for. As I mentioned earlier, one of the features in the accessibility segment that was a little unclear was the tag function. However, it's actually super useful. You can add written notes to certain parts of a voice recording, or even images, to further cement those random rants you went on earlier, and to remind yourself what you were even talking about in the first place. For example, let's say in your voice recording app, you quickly said, "Study A." Well, what does that mean? What does A mean? If you had an image there to show you question A on a test, you'd be able to realize, oh, I need to study question A on the test in order to not mess it up on the exam. Thank you, tags. Tags are also super important for recording longer audio clips. Let's say you're in a lecture and the teacher said something that's a little bit too confusing and you want to go back to it, and you're recording that lecture. Well, if you place a tag at that time frame, instead of listening through the full 3-hour lecture in the future, you could just skip to that part and listen to it over and over again until you finally understand it. Meanwhile, on iOS devices, I'm pretty sure they were going at the voice recording app from an entertainment standpoint. And the reason I believe this is because one of the only secondary functions of this voice recording software is an edit button. I don't know what Apple was expecting. Maybe they wanted people to record their next podcast on this device, or to make sweet remixes of radio songs, but it doesn't make much sense from a productivity standpoint, especially if you have tags as an added feature. When I mean edit, I don't mean cropping a voice recording file, making it shorter or making it longer. I mean, you could skip, jump, speed up, slow down, add echo, add reverb. It's a little over the top, and honestly, I do wish that Android made it a little bit easier to cut up audio clips. That way you can save storage if you're having a full 2-hour lecture recorded. However, the tag functions work just fine, and I don't know why they didn't add them to iOS devices as well. All of this aside, Android still loses in the productivity section of this analysis, simply because it scored a really big dumb point. Let's say, hypothetically, you accidentally started recording a little bit too early, and you want to go and stop it so you can start recording again after the fact and get the information you initially intended on acquiring. Well, on Android, especially if you're in landscape mode, you can't do this, because the keyboard comes up and covers the delete button. And the only button that's left available is the back button, which one would assume, hey, maybe this will take me out of the keyboard menu and open up the main menu so I can delete the file immediately as I initially intended. No, the back button takes you back to the recording and continues recording as though you simply hit the pause button. Great job, Android. So in summary for the first two sections, it is clear that Android better understands the usefulness of an audio recording application on a smart device. It's meant to be more utilitarian and allow you to take notes when needed. However, they messed up trying to add too many features to this application, and at the end of the day, made it a worse experience in almost every category, technically. As I said earlier, I'm going to be doing a 1-week-long field test of these applications to further prove my analysis one way or another. There's going to be much more variables involved, one being time and the other being human emotion, and there's also going to be others that I can't foresee, as I mentioned earlier. And honestly, This is the most important test in my opinion. Regardless of how much I trashed Android throughout this analysis, if I end up using it more for some reason throughout this 1 week period, in my opinion, it's more useful. Whether it be the tag function or something else that I didn't quite see in my initial analysis, if I end up using it more than Apple, in my opinion, that makes it more useful. 1 week later, and I actually predicted it perfectly. The tag function is just that good that it outweighs all of the negative things I said earlier. Being able to actually pinpoint where in a long recording something important is more important than any of the UI failures that Android brought to the table. And I'll explain why in a second. Throughout this experiment, I actually learned a lot about UI and user experience. The main goal of the developer is to figure out what the app's going to be used for. And I think Android did a better job of that, and regardless of how much they may have messed up along the way, knowing what their target demographic is going to be using the software for made it so their application was objectively better in the long run. Sure, I was dishing out dumb points to Android with a fiery passion earlier on in this analysis. However, with time, I got used to those dumb things. They're infuriating to look at simply because they're so obvious and easy to fix in the grand scheme of things, but they're not that big of a deal when you start looking at some of the perks of the software. The tag functionality is a godsend, especially for me. I like to speak pretty cryptically in voice recordings simply because most of the time I'm not really paying attention to what I'm saying, and having a visual context or something to ground certain parts of my rambles makes it so I actually know what I'm talking about. Let's say I'm trying to turn off the oven at a specific time and I ramble something that I can't understand. I will forget, but if I show a picture of the oven and it's on, it'll remind me, oh yeah, I made that voice recording to remind myself to not burn my house down. Thank you, Android. And as I stated earlier, the tag function is also amazing for lectures. I realized throughout this week that instead of scrubbing forward to certain parts that I tagged, I could just click on the tag itself and it'll time skip me directly to where I left off. This is super good for archiving notes for studying later, let's say for exams or tests, because instead of just skipping through and scrubbing to specific parts and trying to guess where you actually put the tag, you just click on it, listen to the information, then click on the next one, etc. One thing that I really wish they added was the ability to export certain tagged segments in order to archive them as actual study notes, but nonetheless, it's still the most useful part of this application, and Apple doesn't even have it, which is why I prefer using Android by far over Apple's recording software. So in conclusion, to some extent, what I've learned throughout this analysis is that knowing exactly what the application is going to be used for is more important than nailing the execution of that application. Doesn't matter how perfected the UI is, or how many features the application packs in. I mean, sure, to an extent these things do matter, but only after a company establishes what useful means to their target demographic. And since Android did this the best in my opinion, good job, Android.